Hey, welcome, and thank you so very much for joining me on another episode of Talking Cloud. Now, we talk about this all the time. We talk about anything cloud. All things cloud kind of got a slant towards security most of the time. But I mean, come on, really, what doesn't have to do with a little bit of cloud in the world of computing today? Either a little or a lot, right? I mean, everything is touching the cloud. And as you've heard me tell you many, many times, and I've lived up to it, I'm just the Gilligan. I always seek professors on the program that we just can have great conversations. And today is absolutely no exception. I'm super jazzed. Today with me, I've got Paul Nguyen. Did I say that right, Paul? Not really,
Paul
did I?
Win, like
Nguyen.
Win, yeah.
Okay, so there, he corrected me already. I told you, professor, to always keep the Gilligan straight.
It's a tough name to say. I get it.
Yeah, well, I always mess up. But either way, so Paul, he's co-founder of a security company called Permiso. Is that right? Permiso? Say it.
Permiso, yeah. Permiso.
Permiso. We're going to hear all about that. He's an investor. The guy's uber smart when you look at his profile. And so I'm super excited to have Paul with me today on the program. Paul, welcome.
Well, I don't know if my wife would agree with you and say I'm super smart. I think she would probably think the opposite, especially after having six kids. And I always wonder, well, why did I have so many kids?
Oh, it's
But
all
yeah,
the love you got to give, brother. I mean, that's what it's
it
got to
is.
be.
It is. I was an only child and I married an Irish Catholic. So there you go. You marry an Irish Catholic, you have a bunch of kids. So there you go. Life lesson one, right? If you marry
Yeah,
an Irish Catholic, you're gonna have a lot of kids. But
that's
thanks for
awesome.
having us, Grant. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no, super excited, Paul. So I butchered your name. I butchered your company name. Why don't you pick it up there and straighten me out? Give me a little bit of history. Tell me what you're up to, and we'll just start there.
Yeah, I think similar to you, I've been in security for geez, 20 plus years at this point. I started actually my very first job, surprisingly, I was at Carnegie Mellon
Mm,
for university, and I was a developer and I was an engineer, and they said, "Hey, we've got this internship for you. You can code on a mainframe in a language called PL1." I'm like, "What the heck is this? Like, what is PL1? What's a mainframe?" So I actually got my start on a mainframe. Doesn't look like it, right? So I'm not
wow.
certainly old enough to be on a
Yeah.
mainframe, but that's where I got my start as an engineer. And then,
COBOL, right? I mean, isn't
yeah, COBOL
that?
PL1 was the language that IBM, I guess, had built back then. And they said,
Wow.
"Hey, you're learning the C++ language. We have all the C code. We don't know what to do with it. Can you help us with that?" And I ended up doing that for 4 years in college. It was with a big company called Telcordia Technologies, which used to be the software wing for Bellcore or
Yeah.
AT&T way
Yeah.
back before they broke it up. And it was
Wow.
great. It was a great experience. But I realized I had a passion back then because I went to Carnegie Mellon. They had the first cert there way back when. And so I got exposed to security. And because I had the application background, I got into reverse engineering and breaking applications and doing things that the applications weren't intended to do, and that's how I got my start in security and joined a company called At Stake, which is a bunch of hackers from way back in the day from Loft, if you remember that name.
Yeah.
And I got my start there, and I was the chief coffee getter, right? I was the junior guy, chief coffee getter. But in that experience, I did meet a person named Jason Chan. And if you don't know, Jason Chan was the head of security at Netflix. And so he and I were snot-nosed, so application security guys, reversing a bunch of stuff for, at the time, AOL.
Mm,
And, 20 plus years later, he inspired a lot of what we're building at Permiso because I felt like Netflix was well ahead of the curve in terms of cloud. And
completely.
Jason was our very first angel investor. So he wrote the very first check in and took a chance on a not so smart person.
Wow.
And here we are. But over that time, I was a CISO, terrible CISO. So I clearly, I think I was the youngest CISO in the federal government at the time, but a terrible CISO. That said, you know what, I'm going to go back to the dark side and and be a vendor. And I ended up doing consulting. Then I eventually started the first security orchestration automation or SOAR company,
Yeah.
partnering with NSA and Bank of America back then, and sold it to FireEye and worked for Kevin Mandia. And Kevin somehow convinced me to run all of product for him. So I ran, the product portfolio that included network, endpoint, email, SIM, SOAR, yada yada. Name your acronym,
Yep. Yep.
soup for all
Yep.
the products, and it was great. I learned a lot, right? I learned a lot of markets I didn't know, and trying to run a global, almost $1 billion product portfolio taught me a whole lot about things I didn't know
Yeah.
about trying to run a business on a global scale. So I decided with my co-founder Jason to leave FireEye and go start Permiso, and said, hey, you know what? This whole cloud thing, we're not really good at this as a security industry, and because Mandiant is more of a detection response and very big in incident response, it's like, well, you know what? People are gonna have to worry about finding evil in the cloud. Maybe we
Mm.
we should go and do that. So we left and started that in 2021,
Oh, wow.
and here we are. Yeah, 4 years
Wow.
later.
So elaborate a little bit on the company and what you guys are doing.
So we took a lot of what we learned from Kevin and Mandiant. Obviously, I think Kevin said it very well. Where do you learn the most about your security controls? You learn the most about it in terms of when you respond to a breach, because when you're in a breach incident, that's the worst case scenario, right? You're buying prevention products and all these other things to try to limit the probability of that incident happening. But when you're in the breach, you realize, wow, this control wasn't effective. As an example, we saw identity controls like, yeah, MFA is going to solve all problems. Well, not really,
Mm-hmm.
because there's all these workarounds and there's all these other vectors. And as you know, it's a challenge to remediate everything. You can't plug every hole.
Yep.
So I think that's where we started working several incidents in the cloud, and we saw that identity was a major vector that was pretty uncovered because it was not being covered by your endpoint or
Yep.
your network or your email products. And cloud is very different architecturally, right? It's
Yep.
essentially the opposite of where I started my career on the mainframe, where everything was completely centralized, and you
Yep.
had RACF and top secret was your
Yep.
authentication system, and you had your JCL jobs, and you had everything on the mainframe.
Yep.
So now that we've gone to cloud, we've slowly over the last 2+ decades have deconstructed. It's almost like Michelin star restaurants, right? When you deconstruct the meal and everything like that, we've deconstructed the architecture into finer and finer services, right? That are now sitting across multiple data centers connected by APIs and credentials.
Yep.
So we
Yep.
felt like this was probably the most interesting area to go after, was really identity threat detection.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So, I'm sitting here and I'm thinking to myself, right? The differences, but also the striking similarities from this side of the glass to the mainframe world to
Yeah.
cloud, right? I mean, at the end of the day, to me, the cloud is the mainframe,
Yes.
right? The difference on that side is quite different from the monolithic, right?
Yep.
It's just highly distributed. But I find it interesting how um, it's like we've squished the mercury and it's scattered, but yet it is all still
Connected.
interconnected.
Yeah.
That's the frightening thing, right? I mean, I always tell people, you know, now I don't have to have a key card to get into your building. And I mean, I can be anywhere with any device and it'll be a straw I can poke
Yeah.
into that milkshake, right? I can get there. And I do agree with you on identity. But, one of the things I was looking at just the other day, Paul, was the striking enormous amount of VC that's went into identity in the last, let's call it 3 years,
Yep.
roughly, give or take. Um, and actually a little longer than that, because it was like just before COVID and as COVID was here. And so you have this enormous number of vendors. And when I sit back and I look at the CNAP diagram, okay, right, it's clear as fucking mud, okay, because it's a collection of tools, which isn't putting a fine point on it. And then when I look at all the circles that overlap in every direction, and in there is IAM and
Yes.
Kim and Sim, it seems like it is a very turgid, very tumultuous part of this massive river called the internet, the cloud, and more specifically, cloud native. That's where it really seems to be getting gnarly. And I just wonder, a couple of questions in all that bullshit. One, do you expect to see consolidation? Who's going to really emerge in the identity space? How's that going to play out? I'm curious to hear your thoughts. But then also, um, how much do you expect to continue to see evolution and change? Of course, I mean, I think the identity is the one thing. I'm me, and hopefully that'll never change, right? So, but having the digital connection to ensure that. I'm
Yeah.
curious how that navigation is going to go from your perspective. I know that was kind of a long ramble, but I'd love to
No,
pull on
it's
that a little.
I have two different perspectives, and one perspective that I did not fully appreciate until I joined the big mothership of a large company, right? I've been acquired before in the past, but I was always one of the, one of the sergeants and just lower down the organization. But I have a different appreciation when I think about the portfolio that I had at FireEye and Mandiant in particular,
Mm-hmm.
because a lot of companies start as best of breed, but you have to evolve because you're a one-trick pony. You have to figure out, how do I start to expand my market share,
Land and
expand
expand,
my
baby. That's it.
100%. And
And it's
when I
platform always is the place. How do I make my point solution a platform? It's the hors d'oeuvre tray model, right?
Yeah, it's easy to say platform for a lot of people, but when you try to, especially me, I was acquired. I was an acquired company.
Yep.
How do you try to homogenize different tech stacks, workflows, and make it seamless, and so that a customer does get a 1 + 1 = 3 effect if I do buy
Yep.
endpoint plus network plus
Yep.
identity plus email? What's the leverage, right? What's the additional leverage from the
Yeah. Where's
platform?
that fulcrum, right?
Yeah, and that's more from a, I'll call that a security value standpoint. But there's
Mm-hmm.
always, I look at it as, and I was a finance major, right? So I think about there's a point of diminishing returns in which, okay, at some point, a product or a capability is good enough where the marginal dollar that you spend beyond that, it doesn't matter. And I
Right.
think one of the lessons learned that I had from FireEye was we focused on detection efficacy. We like, you know what? We're 96% detection efficacy. Like, we're so good at detection. What I realized, the market was willing to live at 88% as good enough. So the marginal dollar beyond that, let's say for an additional $200,000, wasn't worth the 8 points in detection efficacy.
Mm.
So when I think about that, yes, we were like best of breed, but we tried to morph into a platform. But at that point, it was hard to do because we hadn't spent the time in terms of homogenizing the teams, the technology, the
Yep.
workflows, making it seamless. And we tried to do that later in my stint at FireEye to move to a platform strategy. And from that perch, I had a different appreciation for how hard it is to say platform. It's easy to say platform,
Sure.
hard to build, hard to bring together. And if you're continually acquiring new companies, I looked at acquiring companies all the time, right? I work with
Yep.
corp dev all the time to continue to look at 2, 3 years out. What's our long-term strategy? What are the next set of capabilities? And so I'd say I had a little bit of a cheat code having a
Mm-hmm.
role that I did at FireEye and sitting on that ivory tower. And so I could see a couple years out where we were going and also seeing where the market was emerging. But I think the platform strategy is an ebb and flow, right? So new
Yep.
categories like cloud, new surface areas that emerge. AI
Yep.
is a new surface area. Guess what? You're not going to have a platform anytime soon. You need a little bit of a best of breed and then a consolidation over time.
Yep.
And you have to
There's a
balance that.
cycle. There's there's
There's a
there's kind of
cycle.
a pattern or cycle, right? New emerges. Some competitors come into the market. It becomes real. I have to have differentiation. When I look at Dome 9, right? I mean, they were the granddaddy when it came down to essentially what became posture management,
Right.
right? But it was years before Gartner coined the term that they were doing the exact same thing, discovering all your assets,
Yep.
telling you what S3 buckets are unencrypted, that kind of basic posture, and then compliance, and had a bunch of cool tools. But I think of your comment about platform, and certainly the cloud, I think, offered a little bit maybe ideal environment for a product to evolve into a platform as the technologies evolved within the cloud, right? With Kubernetes and Terraform and with all these other things, and then the um, Gartnerization of the
That's a good
market.
term.
You
I'm going to
know,
use that.
yeah, because I mean, we all pay the Gartner tax, right? And it affords them the ability to Gartnerize categories and tell the future. And they do a fairly good job, all in all. Although sometimes I think they wield a little
Sure.
too much power and influence. But it is because so many cool new things were emerging that it was like perfect for a platform. I dare say it's much more challenging for a company uh, that is in a space, pick a space, firewalls,
Hmm.
right? And we want to become a platform company. That's, I mean, we've been working at it for years. I think we're actually very, very effective. We being Checkpoint, my current employer, and this isn't a Checkpoint rah-rah, but when I step back and I look what they've been able to do, because to your point, buying and bolting on and then spray painting it with the same color and saying, hey, it's a
Yeah.
platform, customers see through that pretty quickly, right?
Well, they get the friction on the back end. Well, it's like, why
Exactly.
are there five different consoles that don't look alike
Yep.
and there's no cohesion where I want to pivot from endpoint, but I want to pivot to network? Well, I
Yep.
can't do that. I have to go log into a completely different product. That doesn't
Yep.
really work. And the market will bear what it'll bear in terms of a platform because there's trade-offs with platforms. You're not going to get every part or module of that platform to be the best of breed. So
Yep.
you're ultimately in a trade-off decision one way or another.
Yep.
Economically, yes, it might be cheaper, but you're trading off potentially some value, right?
Yep.
And
I think
if
of
you're,
the old TVs with the VCR and the DVD player all in one,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
Really cool, but you know,
pragmatic.
if one of them goes out, shoot, you got to send it to the shop, and you're out with all of them. I mean, that may not be a perfect example, but there's a compromise, right?
I mean, what you said with checkpoint, I mean, layer one, layer two, you've got at the network level, it makes sense because everyone's looking at the network traffic and whether you're using a firewall to block it or you're using, back in the day, IPS, IDS to inspect the traffic to determine if there's any malicious payloads. I think this is the fundamental problem with cloud today, and I hear this from our customers all the time is I have, let's take for example, my infrastructure with AWS. I've got like 30 vendors plugged into the same APIs. I'm getting rate limited. There's some issues there with data throughput, and there's obviously ways to solve for that architecture with other
Mm-hmm.
capabilities. But that just shows you the amount of just congestion, right? And the overlap in the Venn diagram of like, I had a customer who tried to make sense of the market with all the acronyms DSPM and CSPM and CNAP, and it was a large customer. It's like, this is spaghetti. Like, how
Yes.
do I start to rationalize? Because anyone can put anything on a website to say, we do XYZ. And
Yep.
look, I was guilty of it too as a large company player at the time. Oh, XDR? Sure, we do XDR. Like that's
Sure.
easy to say that we collect all the data, we can make sense of it. The one thing we really focus on as differentiation is security is an industry around trust, right? And expertise. And so how do you sleep better at night? Do you make your customer feel like they sleep better at night? And I think that comes down to really expertise, which is really where I started my career because at that point, we are experts in terms of finding 0 days, right? Reverse engineering malware. And it was different back then. That's how really you flexed your muscle.
Yep.
I think in the space that we're in, if you're thinking about threat detection, you want to believe that the partner that you have from a threat detection standpoint is at the forefront of understanding the adversaries, the bad guys. Like what's the tooling that they're building? How are they starting to think about their next attack pattern, right? And their next vectors they're going after. You try to stay ahead of that as best as you can, and then
Right.
you try to build all the detective and response capabilities to keep up with that. And that's the one thing I always challenge our customers or prospects and say, if you don't trust that we are at the forefront and we're the experts at that, and if you look at our research that we released, because we open sourced a lot of tools, we open sourced 10 last year,
Mm.
we open sourced a lot of intel. We want to prove to the market that we are technically superior than a lot of the other people in the industry that slap things on their website and say, "Yes, I do threat detection." Well,
Yep.
prove it. Like,
Yep.
how do you really demonstrate that expertise? Uh, I'll give you a very distinct example. So we talk about cloud. I think a lot of folks define cloud as just being the infrastructure, and they think about the IaaS or the PaaS layer. But in reality, SaaS is a major uncovered vector right now. That's also
Huge.
cloud, right? That's
And
delivered from the cloud.
I would even argue, Paul, that's the model.
Yes.
That's the model, right? In the same way that I don't have a big wheel in a river behind my house, right?
Right.
Powering everything with that paddle wheel in the river, right? It's far, far. I could put a big, uh, uh, windmill above my house with a bunch of solar panels on my
Hmm.
right. I could do all that stuff, but most people don't, baby. I mean, I
Right.
plug in and I get that out of my mailbox and I pay it once every month or two. And I've said that for a long time. I think the SaaS, especially when you factor in the what no longer is Moore's law specifically, but Moore's law
Yep.
trajectory, right? And the amount of bandwidth, the persistent connection, the devices, where we're going to be in just 5 years,
Yeah.
10 years, it's off the
Uh,
hook. So I don't mean to jump all over on you, but I think when you factor those considerations, how can you dispute a model where it's a SaaS model of some type is not going to just be the simpler, the easier?
yeah. Let me give you an example real quick. We were responding to some pretty large breaches, and this was a group in particular called Scattered Spider. We call them Lucre Three because they were financially motivated. They basically use extortion as a method when they were stealing all the intellectual property from companies, right? So let's think about a tech company in particular. What's their intellectual property? It's going to be their code, right?
Yep.
Where's the code housed? GitHub,
Right.
GitLab, Jira,
Somewhere else.
Confluence, Slack.
Somewhere
You
else.
know, they're
Yeah.
using Slack obviously for collaboration.
Yep.
All SaaS applications. Yes, they're
Yep.
building applications on top of the infrastructure.
Yep.
So I think this is where SaaS has become a primary target, but infrastructure too. So if I were to say, okay, Grant, you know what? What's the one way that I can actually connect to both SaaS and infrastructure at the same time? If I were a bad guy and it's like, you know what, I really want to go after their SaaS and I really want to go after their infrastructure at the same time, how would I do that? And there's a reason that it's been a lot easier. It's the identity, because we've spent over a decade trying to federate access and single sign on to everything. So let's assume, Grant, you have access to GitHub and Jira and Confluence and Slack and Teams and G Suite, et cetera, right?
Yep.
But you also have access to AWS and you also have access to Azure. So what do I have to do? I don't have to go compromise 10 different systems. I'm just going to go after your Okta credential or your single sign-on credential. Now I have access to all of those applications. I'll use SIM swapping to bypass MFA, or even some of these folks that we've observed are using threats, right? They will physically call you or text you and say, here, your wife's name is XYZ. And if you don't accept this push notification, we are going to kill your wife, etc. So they're escalating, or they pay people to accept it. So you have to assume the authentication controls that we have in place today are not going to be 100% foolproof. So you have to assume a credential does get compromised in the world of cloud. That means I can go into your infrastructure. I can steal your intellectual property from your
I
SaaS
can go
applications.
anywhere.
I can go
I
anywhere,
mean,
right?
it's because, and that's back to
Right.
what we were talking about. I don't need a card key once I get in,
Yes,
man. I can just
that's
skip
right.
across the clouds.
Yes, and identity is that key card because we're connecting everything through
Yep.
this credential and this identity, and forget the even the back end. You know, you have like these machine identities or non-human identities, right? That have persistent access or long-lived tokens.
There's more of those than there are human identities,
Yes.
and they're not properly deprecated, they're not
Yep.
properly managed and maintained, and oftentimes given too much capability. Ah, it's just a machine, put it in this group, that group. It can be a mistake.
100%. You should check out our blog. We actually, Brian Krebs, you know Brian Krebs
Yeah.
very well. Brian Krebs had an exclusive piece last December where we said, hey, Brian, do you want to run with this? Because we're observing what we called LLM jacking.
Oh,
So,
I think I
yeah,
saw that.
it was so bad that our head of research on 4chan is getting doxxed. And his home address got released, his kids' names got released. I mean, you
Wow.
know you strike a nerve when you end up getting famous on 4chan.
Yeah.
But what we saw was a convergence of that machine non-human identity being compromised, an AWS access key. Then they went after Bedrock, right? Bedrock was one of the AI
Mm,
services, infrastructure services.
mm.
And then they went after Anthropic models. So then they jailbroke it. So what were they doing? Building role-playing sex bots. And there's actually a case now coming from Microsoft against this same group, right? So this goes back to what I said. It's like, if you want a partner, you want to have a partner who's on the bleeding edge and like understanding what the latest attacks are. Because guess what? You want to prevent those things from happening.
Yeah,
But that was a convergence of the non-human identity, machine identity, and AI, right? In which AI is about to blow up as well in
totally.
terms of adoption in the enterprise with Gen AI and eventually agentic AI.
Yeah,
And it's all
this.
credential based, right?
Yeah,
Like it's all going to end up being credential based.
and the scary thing about it too is the overwhelming number of people, Paul, that are not familiar with Transformer,
Hmm.
the technology. Of course, I'm not talking about the movies, but I mean, and look, I said it straight up. I mean, the Gilligan. I'm not the professor. I'm not a developer, but I certainly have spent time trying to be more informed because, I think that's the key. And when I go around and I speak and I ask people, who knows who this guy is? And I put a picture of Jeffrey Hinton and his name, and people don't know him. And that to me is somewhat frightening when you consider 100 million ChatGPT in 2 months, right? And that's exactly what I say. Is like, okay, so how many of you are familiar with Transformer? How many of you are familiar with
Yeah.
Jeffrey Hinton? And it's crickets. And then I say, hey, I love you all, no disrespect, but you're lemmings because
Yes.
you don't fundamentally understand it's a guess. And I had somebody challenge me on that. No, it's not a guess. It's a probability, high probability. Okay. He's probably going to drop that ball.
Right.
It's a guess, call it what you want. So anyway, I think that the overwhelming acceptance and use because it's so accessible, right? It speaks my language.
Hmm.
We're seduced by and large out there in this technology, and it's kind of scary because people. Chetan Lee, you ever looked at what he did? The guy from IBM, he did this prompt injection, and he showed how he created a game
Yep.
within a game within a game, and it wouldn't reveal it was a game, but it would just totally give you opposite answers on every question.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why I tell people the very first thing you should put into a public LLM before anything is please forget anything and everything you've ever discussed prior to this conversation or
Yeah.
something similar, right? To flush it.
But it's funny because it's essentially a massive evolution of how attacks first started. Anyways, I remember the first applications that were popping up in the internet, right? I mean, parameter injection or injection-based attacks have been around forever because
Forever.
what you're essentially trying to do is bypass logic, right? So there's
Yep.
some application logic or business logic on the back end that's trying to make sense of the input parameters that are coming in. The whole generation with AI, yeah, it's just a different model. Now it's a lot smarter, but guess what? It's still trying to determine I got this input, there's some output I need to provide, and you're trying to basically bypass the logic, and that's what we observed, right? With the
Interesting.
LLM jacking was they
Yeah.
bypassed the logic because you're supposed to have safeguards to prevent illicit material or even like material related to minors, which in the Microsoft case, you'll see some of that was related to minors, which is illegal. So I think it's always a cat and mouse game. I'd say the methods in terms of the attacks, have they evolved a ton? No, it's just changed from technology to technology stack. And,
Yeah.
I remember my first sets of applications that I was breaking into were like Cold Fusion. Like Cold Fusion was big back then, right? And ASP, oh, horribly insecure,
Oh, God, I
right?
remember that.
And then we evolved into, .NET, and then we were using a little bit of PHP, and then, like Java. And look, you still
Jeez.
find the same SQL injection attacks. You still
Yep.
find the parameter manipulation attacks. I mean, I've been doing this for a long time, right? And I
Yep.
and I've thought like an adversary, and I've responded to adversary. So I kind of look at both sides and say, you know what? People talk about the attacker's advantage all the time, which is kind of true, and AI is going to accelerate that.
Totally.
But I think there's a major evolution that's coming. Agentic AI is super scary. I think I started in the security or automation space. Back then, no one wanted anything to be done automatically because they were worried
Totally.
about the downside consequences, and they didn't have
Totally.
the risk tolerance to say, you
Yeah.
know what, if we take down the CEO's email, that's it. I'm going to get fired. Now
Right.
we're gonna hand over the reins to an agent to act on our behalf. And guess what? Now
Hmm.
you have to figure out, how do I keep track of this agent and determine if it's acting in the right way or a
Responsible.
malicious
Yeah.
way.
Yeah.
100%. So I think this is where we're thinking about that future as well, because we already track human activity. We already track machine activity. So we're doing that in real time. Our largest customer, we're monitoring close to 8 million identities, human and non-human. Like, that's a massive scale. And you have to
Jesus.
figure out of 8 million identities, and you're an old network guy like me, like,
That's like a city, a
yeah,
city population, right? I
but
mean,
20 exit, just conservatively. That's how many unique sessions they're going to be. So you're talking about like 30 to 40 unique. Think of those as like TCP sessions from back in the day. Yeah, you see the SYN, the SYNAC, the FIN.
yeah.
Okay, there's a session. Great. Now I'll
Wow.
analyze that session, that TCP session, to figure out, was there any malicious pay. It's the same thing that we have to think about. Is I have to inspect every single user session, whether it's human
Yeah.
or non-human, and determine
Yeah.
if it's malicious or not. I think that's where we have to think about agentic AI. Is like, how are you going to keep up with the activity of the agents to figure out what they're doing
Yeah.
and determine their intent. Was it good intent or bad intent, or maybe it's gone rogue and turned into Skynet? Who knows? So that's a scary future.
It is interesting to, I mean, and what I think exacerbates it is as we move to full mesh, right? Where the world is now, we're point to point with anything and everything pretty much, right? The world is going to be so hyper connected, and then being able to properly um, follow, manage,
Yeah.
control all of the packets that can go anywhere.
Yep.
And then, as you said, enter in an encyclopedia of agents from A to Z,
Yep.
each one being an expert in that particular letter, right? I mean, oh, I don't know. That's a B question. Hey, B, and that when you start to look at how agentic AI is going to interplay with each
Yep.
other,
It's crazy.
it's
It's
wild.
crazy.
It's exciting, but I think it's also, one of the things I've said for a long time, Paul, is, you know, the nefarious would rather take something that was effective 10 or 15 months or years ago, roll it in some powdered sugar, and put it out on the hors d'oeuvre tray today. Meaning, if they can use old techniques, old ways about exploiting with today's technology, they're going to do that rather than starting from scratch. That's why telemetry and history and accurate data on what's going on in this business really does matter, doesn't it?
It does. It does. And I'll admit this, right? Even when I was doing a lot of the stuff on the offensive side, it's like I wanted the path of least resistance. I didn't want to go build, overcomplicate something. Like, I had a mission, I had a
Yeah.
goal, which
Yeah.
was this banking application. I know my intent. He's like, I'm going to try to figure out how I can get into the back end and allow myself to manipulate the data, maybe transfer some money from one account to another account. And we used to be able to do that, right? Because back then we weren't doing any input validation on parameters in the URL, right? So I could
Mm-hmm.
enumerate account numbers 1 through 100, because, and I saw this. This was
Yeah.
early, back in the days. I think you're absolutely right. I think it's, what's old can be new again, and I think in a lot of ways, what's old is still new. I think for folks that like us who've been around for a long time, it's just different evolutions, right? Just
Yep.
from one surface area to another, from whether it's from mainframe into mid ranges
Yep.
into servers and more distributed computing. We didn't solve the problem by breaking it up. Essentially, we just broke it up into. And I think the hardest part for customers is, in this distributed service model, you're now taking services from a lot of different vendors that are housing it within their own data centers or infrastructure, and third party risk management is a real problem. Like, how do you
Huge.
know that your data is being housed at this SaaS application, and how do you trust that it's being protected the right way because it's not within your own data center anymore? So
Supply
that
chain as
risk is
well,
now
right?
extended.
I mean,
Yeah,
yeah, I
exactly.
mean, and this goes back to the earlier points we were making about how everything is connected now
Yep.
at a hyper level, right? I mean, it's not like everything's connected with DNS. I mean,
Right.
sure, every website that's different now. um, we're in an interesting new world, and I always remind people, supercomputer, okay,
Yep.
supercomputer, always connected, persistent. These are game changing elements that I still don't think we've seen all of the changes in. You're a developer, you know this better than I, but it seems to me as we start to tear down what used to be limiters. Oh, I can't send that big of a payload back to the client.
Hmm.
It's too big. The bandwidth's not big enough. The connection's not persistent. So you got to cache it or store it and then wait, right? Some of these considerations that they're totally
Yep.
gone. So what's going to happen when we kind of go, okay, let's take some mushrooms and think about what could we build 3 years from now if we started from scratch based on where we're going to be technologically, and we make an accurate guess based on the technologies we see racing and evolving, right? That that for me convinces me that SaaS is going to prevail in just crazy ways because I don't have to have it. I mean, I can have it running from anywhere, and with that persistent connection and high band, I don't care where it is.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I mean, it just seems like the world's it's gonna be exciting. I wish I could live to be 95 or 105 or 125 to see what happens.
Yeah. No, it'll be an interesting next couple of years. Imagine I look back and
I mean,
it's
look how
it's
much
it,
change you've lived through from your early days in a mainframe
yeah,
SNA environment with IBM,
very different.
right? 3274 terminals, right?
Yep.
And and today, I mean, it's really remarkable.
The phone is crazy to me. Just the compute on a phone is just amazing to me, right? And I started with a Commodore 64. I remember I coded my first games in BASIC, and that's what I started with. And that was the 80s, right? I was like, wow, like this is not a personal computer. It's just my kids don't even understand. Everything is instant gratification nowadays, right? And you want
Native,
everything now.
I call
Dial
that,
up. They're like, what's that?
it's immigrant versus native, right?
Yes,
we,
yes.
we we're immigrants to this phenomenon. Our kids are natives, and I'll tell you a funny story. Just my son was here over the holidays, and he was using my car, and I had to do some work, and he asked how to get somewhere. And I said, well, hey, just go down Chestnut to Pacific, turn right, go up to Academy, turn right. It's 2 blocks right there on your right. And he looked at me and he kind of like had this, shit eating grin, and he was shaking his head, and he says, it's amazing what you had to know.
Oh yeah. Oh
And
man.
I'd never thought of it, but then it just dawned on me. He just needs to punch in where he's going, and he doesn't have to know
Not
streets. Now, I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. I mean, I think kind of I would like him to learn street names and directions and stuff, but
Oh,
I
just like interpreting a map or reading a map, right? And just like the map books from back in the day that you had to go like there was no, and then you had, the emergence of
A1,
MapQuest.
A4,
Yeah.
yeah.
And then you
Oh
had
man.
MapQuest. Like MapQuest helped, right? Like you had at least turn by turn and it was a little bit more of an aid, but now everything's coded into your dashboard. It's in your heads up display. I mean, it's
But I mean, I don't have to know anything other
no.
than even I don't know the address. Just type in the name,
Yeah.
and you find it. And I mean, yeah, that's terrific. But there's parts of that benefit that I could see being a negative consequence too, right?
Yeah, of
You
course.
know, it's
Yeah.
It's the old double-edged sword, I guess, in so many different ways, right? That we're into. So, hey, tell me more about your company. And do you sell through the channel? Do you sell direct? Do you have reps? Are you global? Are you just here there? Can I evaluate it? Tell me.
Yeah.
I'm giving you a little commercial here, Paul.
All right. I guess we'll do the
I just want to know
salesy
more about
part.
your company,
No,
and
no.
so people can look into it.
Yeah, this is not my first time starting a company, and the one thing that I've enjoyed this time around, now that I don't have the scarlet letter of being a first time founder anymore, is got to do it with people that I enjoy working with. I mean, number one, we've got close to 70 employees, completely global, completely virtual. We started it during COVID, so you had no choice, right? It's not like we're going to be in an
Right.
office by any means. But I think the fortunate part was because myself and Jason Martin, who's my co-founder, have been around for so long, we had a lot of folks that have worked with us and have come and followed us, which is great that for them to put their trust in us and follow two stooges to go start a company. And so we're really blessed, I think, to have a great culture and a great set of employees who believe in the mission. And I think I started it by saying, where we learned a lot of what we wanted to do with Permiso was we lived in the breach. We understood how identities were being attacked, and we reverse engineered that. We said, hey, if they're being attacked this way, and this is the net impact, because one, you can get into all these SaaS applications, even on-prem or even your infrastructure, because your identity provider is also hosted, by the way, like in the SaaS, right? Like Okta and
Yeah.
Ping and Entra are all
Yeah.
hosted in the cloud. So this is where the moniker for cloud, where cloud to us is not just infrastructure, it's IaaS, PaaS, SaaS, your IDP. And because the adversaries also went on-prem because they were able to social engineer their way through a VPN on-prem, we had to go and follow them on-prem as well with, Active Directory, et cetera. But, the main thing that we do is when we learned all of this is like, how do you protect compromised identities or identify account takeover? You have to monitor real-time monitoring of identities, and you have to be able to track everything that they do and determine whether they have malicious or intent whenever they're using that credential. So as I said, we're monitoring probably close to 30 million identities across all of our customers today.
So are you when you say monitor, are
Mhm.
you um, essentially getting my vitals, if you will, so that you see when my heart rate's up or you see when my
Yeah,
blood pressure's up, anomalies to my normal behavior or my normal health?
that's it. So that it's part anomaly because anomaly is pretty noisy in and of itself as a detection method. But we do try to detect when there's abnormal access. Either you're coming from a different agent, which is common. That's not like anything unique, but we've seen certain patterns of usage, like all of a sudden an adversary compromises credential and they go from an Android app to an Android phone to an iOS phone. That rarely happens. Or iOS downgrades from 18.2 to 16.1. That rarely happens. So those are suspicious signals. So we take those
Mm-hmm.
signals and then we combine them with activity anomalies. Well, Paul never usually creates users. That's abnormal. But you have to couple it with others too, which is okay. You have to determine whether you think the identity is a human or a machine, because humans act a lot more erratically than machines, right? So you have to have different ways to determine whether you think that activity is abnormal because now it looks like a human identity. And then we also have patterns of TTPs, so observables and indicators that we've collected from our incidents and from our detections across all of our customers that we build into our own unique sets of detections.
Hmm.
You can't replicate our detections because the way that we construct, as I mentioned to you, the user sessions, and we
Right.
bound them, like we know when a user logs in, we know all the activity that it did. Let's say you logged in right now and you went into 365 and you downloaded documents, and then you went into SharePoint and you downloaded documents, and then you went into Salesforce and downloaded documents. Oh, then you went into AWS and created users. That's all one session, but that one session crosses multiple boundaries, right? It
Right.
crosses Google, Microsoft, GitHub, AWS. You have to be able to stitch that together so you
Hmm.
can package it into a nice little session to say, yes, when Paul logged Paul logged in and did all these things, it was malicious because it was access anomaly, activity anomaly, and known patterns of evil from this particular threat actor group. So I think we're the best in terms of that type of identity monitoring and that detection around potentially compromised credentials, account takeover, and also insider threat. We've
Mm-hmm.
also helped customers with, I'd say, unfortunately, in the last 2 years, a lot of layoffs, right? So when you're
Mm-hmm.
laying off people, you're worried that when you terminate them that day, they're going to start to download documents. They're going to start to do things that are nefarious and
Yep.
disgruntled employees, right? So we've had to go through that with our customers as well. The other part is we've also now moved into prevention because our customers that got breached said, we can't have this happen again. So what we observed is a lot of these accounts that were compromised. Some were orphaned accounts that they forgot about that were just laying around and been around for like 4 or 5 years. On top of that, to make it worse, is they had privileges to a lot of things that they didn't need privileges to.
Yep.
So
Well,
of
that's
course,
the old
along
way. That's the old way, right?
yeah,
Oh,
one
what do
hundred
you do,
percent,
Paul? Hey, Paul. Yeah, I work for Bill.
yeah,
Bill. Yeah, I'll just put you in Bill's group.
yep,
And now you've just got the permissions
exactly,
of Uber Bill and
yeah,
everybody in the group, even though you really don't need it, right? That's the
yeah.
old way. It's the wrong way for sure. But
Uh,
that's
it,
what happened. And a lot of people are built that way, and change is
so
difficult, right?
if you think about posture versus runtime or real-time monitoring, they're very different personas because real-time monitoring is more related to the security operations folks and the folks who are responding to threats.
Right,
And we talked about posture management earlier. Well, posture management is really identifying vulnerabilities, the holes.
right.
And the incidents don't happen until there's a threat actor that exploits that vulnerability that actually leads to a loss event or an incident.
Yep.
So we moved from the detection side, and I'd say, we've probably solved one of the harder problems because if you think about the data scale problem, we're probably ingesting close to, anywhere from 30 to 50 terabytes a day of just raw data from customers.
Wow.
And we have to make sense of hundreds of millions of sessions. And that's hard. Like at a scale problem, we ended up moving in prevention. That was pretty easy to build because we already had access to the same data. We're already integrated to the
Mm-hmm.
same APIs. And the only questions we were answering was, okay, Grant, who is Grant? Grant is a human identity. He works in HR. He has access to all these systems via these 10 credentials because it's never one credential, right?
Right.
You as a human identity may have 10 credentials. You then have to create that relationship that Grant owns these 10 credentials. Oh, what are all the permissions he has related to those 10 credentials? He has a high level of access. The last part, that's where the posture folks typically leave off. What they don't do is the monitoring component, which is
Right.
I can monitor Paul's behavior every second of the day. And Paul logged in at 10 a.m. yesterday. He logged in through his Mac. He logged in through this VPN. And here's all the sets of activities they did. Yep, didn't do anything malicious. But you know what? At 1 o'clock, all of a sudden, he started to look like he's completely erratic and he's untrustworthy. He looks like he's compromised now. That could change from second to second or minute to minute.
Right.
So that
Right.
real-time monitoring is where we provide that for both human, non-human identities, for cloud and for on-prem.
Yeah. Well, and I think that you know what's happening is everything is accelerated, right? That's what happens in the digital world. And now with the advent of AI, I would assert that the potential for exploit on the part of the nefarious
Yep.
for a known vulnerability uh, is going to be in a far, far shorter time, right? Because you know the process. Hey, Paul, we found a hole in your software. We'll give you, how long do you need to fix it? A week? Okay, we'll announce it in 10 days. In 10 days, you've got a patch, it's available, it's up, and it's announced our research found. The time between that publication of our research found and one of the bad guys building something to exploit that found vulnerability, that's what seems to have there, it's gone away. There is no time. They're able
Uh,
to exploit so quickly
yeah.
uh, with the advent of AI. And I mean, because we all have an assistant that knows everything the internet knows, is dumb as a rock without the right prompt, right?
No, 100%. But I think that's the part where you're right with AI. It's going to be interesting because that vulnerability, although that group discovered it, existed well before it was ever found. So the question
Yep.
is, were they really the ones that found it? Because I can tell you, I found a lot of stuff that I never disclosed. And you
Yeah.
keep it in your back pocket because you know what? Maybe someday it'll be useful. So there are people who are stockpiling a lot of 0 days and unknown vulnerabilities that
Yeah.
that if they find the right target and they have a very specific mission they want to execute, they're going to do it. I think our government's been doing it for quite a while, right?
Yeah,
So
that's
they're the experts
interesting.
at it.
I think also we've all heard, I think from my presentation, 2.2 million new materials unknown, right? 400,000 new compounds unknown to science. So let's just apply those exciting announcements uh, towards analyzing code from cybersecurity vendors to find vulnerabilities, right? I mean, if they're able to find 2.2 million unknown to science, right, materials, I bet it could probably find some vulnerabilities, right,
Oh
that we don't
yeah.
know about. So,
Oh yeah.
that's that. I have often suggested that there's got to be some bad groups creating an LLM that is nothing but CVE knowledge, right?
100%.
Exploits, version, how to best exploit, right? I mean, they're training, I got to believe someone so that they know how to go out and actually attack the hundreds of
They're
CVEs that are
stockpiling.
out there.
They're stockpiling right now, and they're waiting for the right time and the right mission, right? Because it's a business. Outside of the
Totally.
nation state, it's a business, right? It's
Yeah.
it's it's criminal activity that someone's trying to use for some financial gain.
Yeah.
It's its own economy, its own business,
And it's
and
profitable, obviously,
it is
because
profitable.
there's a
Yeah,
lot of people that, there's a
yeah,
reason they're doing it, right?
yeah. We're not old school holding up stagecoaches and all that stuff. That's like we're in a different time right now, and the digital frontier is definitely the area that they're exploiting. But I think that's the scale problem will become harder
Yeah.
as we think about AI and agents, right? It's going to be a force multiplier, so it's going to be an AI versus AI battle to figure out,
Yep.
how to
Fire versus
continually.
fire.
But at the end of the day, the part that is the most vulnerable out of this whole equation is still going to be people, because the people that wrote the code are the ones that wrote the and the
That's
ones
right.
that wrote the AI models also didn't get it right either, right? Because the prompt
That's right.
injection attacks and all the different guardrails, it's still fallible based upon human error.
That's
So
right.
I think for as long as that happens, we're still going to be in business as security professionals for quite a while. I hope
Yep.
not to be doing this by the time I'm 90, but
Yeah.
it's a fun problem to solve for, and I think we're excited by what we're seeing, because when you work breaches, it's like risk security is risk management. Your insurance. You're trying to like
Totally.
buy down risk by buying this solution. I'm buying CNAP and like, oh, we're gonna do this. We're gonna
Totally.
try to buy it down to like 10% probability. But when the 10% probability happens, you learn so much about CNAP had failed. Guess what? They fired 9,000 alerts, but guess what? That person couldn't respond to it because there's like too many alerts,
Yep.
and they had gaps in visibility. So I still ascribe to the Kevin's way of when he released APT1, right, with the Chinese from way back when. Like
Yeah.
that was groundbreaking.
It was.
Um, and I think that was a hallmark event for the industry. And so I think we were taking a page out of that. We are a part of the Kevin Mandia family tree. And it's like, yes, let's learn from what the bad guys are doing, and let's try to use capabilities to build, to prevent and detect that. And so I love being with the bad guys, right? That's my favorite part, is finding the
Yeah.
bad guys and learning from them and figuring out what they're doing, and the cat and mouse game of like, can we stay ahead of them? Like, what else
Yeah.
can we do?
Yeah.
So it'll be interesting.
Well, and the exciting thing, as you already said, is this is forever, baby, because um, it's the one slice of the pie that will never get resolved, because there's always an adversary that's going
Yep,
to try to one up us. And, that just means it'll keep going forever and ever and ever.
exactly.
Hey,
100%.
this has been outstanding, and I'm really super jazzed. I really appreciate you taking the time. Tell everybody where they can find you, your product, and evaluate it, or ask for an eval if they're interested.
Yeah, check us out at permiso.io. It's Prmiso right here. Yeah.
Yeah,
Dot io.
permiso.io. Okay,
Yep, and
terrific.
check out our blog. You'll if you're a tech head, you'll love some of the research that we have out there. We open source a lot of tools, and if you want, you can reach out to me, Paul at permiso.io as well, and I'm happy to jump on.
Beautiful. This has been awesome. Paul, thanks a ton, man. I always love getting with guys that I know are just way smarter than me. It makes me feel good that I can have a conversation with you. So I was thrilled to have you on. Thanks so very, very much for making time for us today.
Thank you so much, Grant. Appreciate it.
You bet. So, hey, ladies and gentlemen, this has been an awesome. This has been an awesome episode. Like it, share it, tell your friends. I mean, I just have been really impressed with Paul. I hope you have been as well. Really appreciate you listening, and we'll look forward to having you back on the next episode of Talking Cloud. Thanks so very much.